My name is Ren Calloway, and if you've ever had to sit in absolute, suffocating silence while someone spent an hour explaining your own life's work to you, then you already know the exact feeling I'm about to describe. You know that tight, heavy sensation that creeps up into your chest. You know the immense discipline it takes to actively remind your facial muscles not to move, not to twitch, and not to give away the absolute storm brewing right behind your eyes. You just sit there, holding a glass of water, nodding politely, while the person across from you digs a massive psychological hole for their own ego. Before we dive into how this dinner table became a legal battlefield, I want to ask you a serious question. If you've ever had to earn your place in a room where people automatically assumed you didn't belong just because of your age or your gender, type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Let's see how many of us have had to play the long game against someone who thought they owned the room. It was a Sunday evening in early October, the kind of crisp, clear autumn night where everything is supposed to feel warm, inviting, and safe. The drive out to the suburbs had been framed by beautiful old oak trees, turning deep crimson at the edges, but the atmosphere inside the dining room was anything but peaceful. Instead, I was sitting at a meticulously set formal table, watching a perfectly good plate of artisanal pot roast and homemade rolls go completely cold. Across from me sat my boyfriend's father, Boyd Whitmore. He was a large, imposing man who occupied space with the unearned confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades commanding rooms without ever being questioned. Boyd was a retired county district attorney, and he wore those 30 years of service like an invisible heavy set of old military medals pinned proudly to his chest. He had a deeply ingrained habit of talking the way some men do when they are absolutely, unflinchingly certain that they are the smartest, most experienced person in any room they walk into. His voice wasn't particularly loud, and he wasn't being overtly rude or aggressive. It was actually much worse than that. His words were wrapped in a very particular kind of slow, patronizing patience. The deliberate, agonizing cadence of a schoolmaster explaining a basic math problem to a child who keeps getting the answer wrong. For the better part of an hour, I quietly folded and refolded my linen napkin into a perfect, sharp square in my lap, while Boyd lectured me relentlessly on how the federal judiciary had completely lost its way. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his second glass of expensive Cabernet, and talked about how federal judges were insulated from the real world. He claimed they hid behind a thick wall of brilliant 20-something clerks, burying themselves in procedural rules and abstract constitutional arguments while making sweeping decisions that shattered real lives without ever having to feel the actual weight of a chaotic courtroom. When he finally paused to take a slow, satisfied sip of his wine, he leaned across the linen tablecloth, fixed his calculating eyes on me, and asked if a young corporate lawyer working in private practice could even begin to comprehend that kind of heavy, real-world pressure. I looked back at him across the table, completely unbothered, matched his level gaze, and thanked him very calmly for the context. I told him, with a slight smile, that I would be sure to keep his unique perspective in mind when I returned to the federal courthouse at 9 o'clock Monday morning. Boyd laughed. It was a booming, comfortable, satisfied sound that rattled the crystal glassware between us. He honestly thought I was making a dry, polite little joke just to fit into his world. He had absolutely no idea that I wasn't joking at all. What Boyd Whitmore didn't know, and what my boyfriend Cal had been entirely too terrified to tell him over the last 8 months, was that I wasn't just some quiet associate handling paperwork for corporate clients. 3 weeks prior, after a grueling public appointment process, a mountain of intensive federal background checks, A stressful committee hearing, and a final Senate vote, I had been officially sworn in as a federal district judge. At 32 years old, I was one of the youngest federal judges confirmed in the entire country that year, and the youngest ever appointed to serve our specific district. To truly understand how we ended up at that tense dinner table and why I chose to sit through an hour of a retired prosecutor condescending to me, you have to understand the sheer, sobering weight of that black silk robe. When you are a young woman in the legal field, people are constantly looking for reasons to assume you don't belong or that you haven't paid your dues. They look at your age, they look at your quiet disposition, and they mistake your silence and observation for hesitation or weakness. But when someone hands you that robe and you put it on for the first time, the weight doesn't come from the heavy fabric. It settles across your shoulders as the sudden, terrifying realization that your written words now carry the full, unyielding enforcement power of the United States government. At work, inside the marble walls of the courthouse, I was Judge Calloway. Major civil fortunes, structural constitutional precedents, and human lives hung on my daily rulings. But in the rest of my life, away from the benches and the security details, I was just Wren. I was the woman who forgot to water her overgrown houseplants, burned the sourdough toast on Sunday mornings, and had massive, unapologetic weak spot for terrible reality television after spending a long, exhausting week listening to high-stakes arguments in court. My boyfriend, Cal, knew the difference between the title and the person, and he respected it completely. He was an architect, practical, precise, gentle, and he had a beautiful way of asking careful questions that made you feel deeply heard rather than interrogated. We had been together for 2 years, and he had been my absolute rock through the entire agonizing months of the confirmation process. He knew exactly what I did, but outside of work, he treated me just as Wren. That was the version of me he wanted his parents to meet. But in trying to protect me from his father's massive ego, Cal had accidentally set a trap that was about to spring on all of us. The trouble with a lie of omission is that it requires constant maintenance. It is like an unstable architectural structure. You build one false wall to hide a view you don't like, and suddenly, you have to reinforce the entire ceiling just to keep it from collapsing on your head. That was the exact reality Cal was facing as he stood at my kitchen island a week before the scheduled dinner. I was sitting at the wooden table, a half-eaten piece of artisanal sourdough toast resting on a ceramic plate beside me, while I reviewed an incredibly dense brief regarding an upcoming antitrust motion. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, hitting the row of slightly neglected ferns on my windowsill. Outside, it was a peaceful morning, but inside the kitchen, the tension was palpable. Cal was slicing crisp green apples into perfect uniform wedges, his movements overly precise, his jaw clamped shut. He was actively avoiding eye contact with me, which, after 2 years of being together, I knew was his absolute giveaway for carrying a heavy secret. "My dad's been pushing again," Cal said, his voice forcedly casual as the silver blade clicked sharply against the dark wood of the cutting board. I didn't look up from my legal documents immediately. "Pushing about what, exactly?" "About you," he replied, finally setting the knife down with a soft, hollow thud. "About when he can finally meet you properly. He wants us to come out to the house for Sunday dinner next week." I set my reading glasses down onto the brief and offered him a warm, reassuring smile. "Well, that seems entirely reasonable, Cal. We've been living in the same city for 2 years, and I've only ever spoken to your mother briefly on the phone. It's about time I met the legendary Boyd Whitmore. I'm looking forward to it." Cal didn't smile back. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck, exhaling a long, ragged breath that sounded like a slow deflation. There's something I should probably tell you first, Ren. In my line of work, first as a public defender and now on the federal bench, I have spent a lifetime listening to people speak under intense pressure, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the sentence, "There's something I should probably tell you," almost never precedes good news. It is the universal preface for an incoming confession, the verbal flinch before the blow lands. I folded my hands over my legal papers and looked at him directly. "All right, I'm listening." Cal turned to face me fully, leaning his lower back against the marble counter. "My dad. He's proud of his career. Ren. Very proud. 30 years as the county's head district attorney means he spent his entire adult life being the absolute authority in his jurisdiction. Because of that, he has incredibly rigid, unyielding opinions about the law, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and especially about the federal courts." "What kind of opinions?" I asked, my tone perfectly neutral, though my professional curiosity was piqued. "The kind that come from 30 years of watching federal judges overturn convictions he worked incredibly hard to build," Cal said, looking at me carefully, watching for my reaction. He genuinely thinks the modern federal bench has completely lost its way. He calls it too political, too academic, and completely removed from the actual grit and human reality of law enforcement. I considered that for a moment, tapping my finger against the table. "Those are fairly common criticisms, Cal. I hear them all the time from old-school state prosecutors. It doesn't bother me." "Yeah, well, here's the real problem," Cal sighed, shifting his weight uneasily. "He doesn't know you're on the federal bench." I raised an eyebrow, the silence stretching between us for a beat. "What exactly does he think I do for a living, Cal?" Cal made a pained, intensely embarrassed face that I had never quite seen on him before. "I told him you were a lawyer, in private practice. Corporate defense, commercial litigation, something safe and corporate." I stared at him, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet kitchen. "You told your father I was in private practice. For how long have you been letting him believe that?" "Since the first time you came up in conversation, which was about 8 months ago," Cal admitted, looking genuinely ashamed. "I panicked, Ren. Back then, you were in the middle of the vetting process, and your nomination was all over the regional legal news. I knew that if I told him I was dating the brilliant young woman who was about to be appointed to the federal bench, he wouldn't see you. He would have formed a massive wall of professional prejudices, academic resentment, and political opinions before you even walked through his front door. He would have treated you like an ideological opponent instead of his son's girlfriend. I just wanted him to meet Ren first, not the title." I sat back in my chair, looking out the window at the autumn leaves. I didn't get angry. I understood the protective impulse, even if it was profoundly misguided. Being introduced as a federal judge at 32 years old has a bizarre tendency to completely change the temperature of a room before your coat is even hung up. People either become completely stiff, artificial, and formal, or they immediately want to aggressively litigate a high-profile verdict they read about in the morning paper, as if you personally owe them a detailed explanation for every single decision a court has ever made since 1789. Neither reaction makes for a comfortable Sunday dinner. "So let me get this completely straight," I said, a small, wry smile tugging at the corner of my lips. "You want me to go to his house for a formal Sunday dinner?" "Yes," Cal said, his eyes filled with a desperate, hopeful light. "Without mentioning my appointment or the courthouse at all. Just for this first initial meeting." "Exactly," Cal nodded rapidly. "You'd just be Ren, my girlfriend, who happens to be a lawyer." I thought about it seriously. There was a strange, almost appealing simplicity to the idea. One dinner where I didn't have to carry the professional weight of the district. A single meal with a man who would have to decide what he thought of my character, my intellect, and my humor before he knew a single thing about the immense power of my courtroom. "All right," I said, nodding slowly. "One dinner. I will be Ren the corporate lawyer, but you owe me the full unedited story about why you panic so easily around your father." Cal let out a massive breath, a brilliant, relieved smile breaking across his face. "It's not a short story, Ren." "I'm a federal judge, Cal," I smiled back, pulling my antitrust brief back toward me. "Trust me, I have plenty of patience." But as I looked down at the dense legal text in front of me, I couldn't shake a lingering feeling of unease. I had agreed to play a part, to step into a household under a false pretense, all to appease the massive ego of a retired prosecutor I had never met. I was willing to do it for Cal, because I loved him, and because I knew how heavy the shadow of a powerful father could be. What I didn't realize, however, was that Boyd Whitmore's shadow extended far beyond his living room walls, and that the professional web he had woven during his final years in office was already spinning its way directly toward my federal desk. The drive out to the suburbs on that Sunday afternoon was a study in unspoken tension. Cal's silver sedan moved smoothly along the winding two-lane roads, which were lined with towering oaks shedding crisp, deep red leaves onto the asphalt. The autumn air outside was cool and clean, but inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick. Cal was gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were stark white, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "You've changed lanes 4 times in the last 2 miles, Cal," I said gently, keeping my eyes fixed on a rustic. Its farms passing by on the right, its wooden tables stacked high with pumpkins and jugs of fresh apple cider. "If you keep this up, we're going to get pulled over before we even make it to your parents' street." He exhaled a sharp, ragged breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as he relaxed his grip on the wheel. "That's just driving, Ren." "No, that's nervous pacing, but with a 2-ton piece of machinery," I countered smoothly, turning my head to look at him. "Cal, look at me. You're completely overthinking this entire thing. I promised you I would play the part of the polite, quiet corporate attorney, and I intend to keep that promise." He drummed his fingers anxiously against the steering wheel, his jaw tightly set. "You don't know him, Ren. You don't understand how he operates. He spent 30 years as a head district attorney, pushing people until they give him exactly what he wants. Isn't just his profession, it's his default mode of communication. The very second he finds out you do litigation, he is going to push. He's going to cross-examine you on every single detail of your practice. Then I will handle him the way I handle any aggressive attorneys," I said, my voice completely level and calm. "I'll say my focus is federal litigation." "He'll ask what kind of litigation," Cal warned immediately, his voice rising a fraction. "And I'll tell him that I work directly with the operations of the court system. It is technically entirely true, and it completely keeps the peace." Cal gave me a brief, deeply skeptical look before turning his attention back to the road. "That is cutting it incredibly close to the truth, Ren." "I deal with the truth for a living, Cal," I murmured, leaning my head back against the headrest as we turned onto a wide, flat street lined with neatly manicured lawns. "Don't worry. It will be a perfectly fair, balanced conversation." We pulled into the driveway of a well-maintained split-level house at the very end of the cul-de-sac. In the side yard, a large vegetable garden sat spent and withered for the season, its brown stalks leaning against wooden stakes. On the front porch, 2 weathered wooden chairs stood on either side of a matching table, looking as though they had seen decades of quiet afternoon use. The front door swung open before our boots even touched the first wooden step of the porch. Boyd Whitmore stood in the doorway, a massive, imposing man who occupied space with the natural, unbothered dominance of someone who had simply always been the most powerful person in the room. His hair was a sharp, neat silver at the temples. His jaw was square and completely unyielding, and his eyes were a piercing gray. As he stepped down onto the porch to greet us, his handshake was exactly what I had anticipated. Firm, crushing, and designed entirely as a psychological test to see if I would flinch under his authority. I didn't flinch. I matched his exact level of pressure, holding his gaze with a steady, unblinking focus. I caught a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. A brief flicker of recalculation, before he let go and stepped back to let us enter. "Wren," he said, his deep, booming voice turning my name into a statement of fact rather than a warm welcome. "Mr. Whitmore, it's wonderful to finally meet you," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and entirely composed. Before the tension could linger, Ruth appeared from the hallway, wiping her hands on a crisp white dish towel. She was a small, quick-smiling woman who practically radiated warmth, providing an instant, sharp contrast to her husband's rigid presence. She pulled Cal into a fierce, genuine hug and then turned to me, her eyes crinkling with real affection as she took my hands in hers. "Finally," Ruth said with a soft laugh. "We've been asking Cal about you for months." "Only good things, I hope," I replied, smiling warmly. "Mostly," Ruth joked softly, her eyes flicking briefly and knowingly toward her husband in a way that suggested she had been doing a great deal of quiet management of his massive ego for a very long time. As we stepped into the entryway, the house immediately wrapped us in the rich, comforting aromas of slow-cooked pot roast, fresh rosemary, and baked apples. But as I looked around the formal living room, the decorative warmth faded. 2 entire walls were lined from floor to ceiling with heavy oak bookshelves, organized meticulously by subject matter: criminal law, regional politics, constitutional history, and trial tactics. Hanging on the wall near the kitchen entrance were several framed, yellowed newspaper clippings celebrating Boyd's most high-profile convictions from decades past. He had been a prominent fixture in the county paper, clearly. Boyd noticed me looking at the articles and walked over, standing close enough to block out the rest of the room. 30 years, he said, his voice dropping into a low, proud rumble as he looked at the faded ink. A lot of high-stakes cases. A lot of work went into those headlines. "It looks like an incredibly extensive career, Mr. Whitmore," I said, keeping my posture relaxed and my voice entirely neutral. "Some people in the county thought I stayed on too long," Boyd said, offering a dry, bitter little chuckle that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "But I say if the work still matters, you stay in the fight. You don't abandon the courtroom just because the rules get complicated." Ruth called us into the dining room before the conversation could dig any deeper. The table was set beautifully with a crisp linen cloth, formal cloth napkins, and the family's good crystal glasses. Ruth waved me toward a chair with the easy, unyielding authority of a woman who ran her dining room exactly as she intended, completely independent of her husband's dominant presence. Boyd took his seat at the absolute head of the table, sitting down like a veteran prosecutor preparing to open a trial. I sat directly across from him, while Cal sat to my right, his posture stiff, looking as though he were prepared to leap between us at a moment's notice. The first 20 minutes of the meal passed with a deceptive sense of normalcy. Ruth's pot roast was exceptional, tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a fork, and the homemade rolls were as comforting as the crisp October breeze outside. Cal began to relax his shoulders slightly, engaging his mother in a detailed conversation about his latest architectural project, a massive 18-month community center renovation in the heart of the city. Ruth listened with genuine, animated interest, asking about the materials and the timeline. Boyd, however, sat back sipping his Cabernet with the patient, detached expression of a seasoned trial lawyer waiting for the chatter to clear so he could steer the room back toward his own preferred territory. The shift occurred the exact moment Boyd refilled his wine glass and leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms against the edge of the linen tablecloth. He locked his gray eyes onto me, a slow, confident smile spreading across his square jaw. "So, Wren," he began, his voice taking on that comfortable, theatrical resonance of a man who didn't ask questions to learn, but to lecture. "Cal tells me you completed your legal education at Yale Law. I've encountered a fair share of Ivy League graduates over my 30 years in the office. They turn out some brilliant academics up there in Connecticut, I'll give them that. But academic theory doesn't teach you what the law actually feels like when you're standing in the dirt of a real courtroom." I set my water glass down smoothly, maintaining a calm, unblinking focus. "Yale has its share of academics, certainly," I agreed, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "But it also produces some highly capable practitioners." "Perhaps," Boyd chuckled, cutting aggressively into his beef with a practiced precision. "But the problem with institutions like that is, they focus entirely on precedent, abstract philosophy, and constitutional theory. They forget that the law isn't a chess game played on paper. It's about people. It's about the raw reality of the victim, the raw desperation of the defendant, and the 12 regular citizens sitting in a jury box who have to make sense of it all. If you don't look those regular people in the eye, you don't understand the case." "I think that's incredibly true," I replied mildly, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "The human element is something no practitioner should ever lose sight of." Boyd looked thoroughly pleased, taking my immediate agreement as a sign of intellectual submission. He leaned back, warming to his topic, his gestures becoming wider and more animated. "A lot of attorneys do lose sight of it, though, especially on the federal side." He said federal side with a subtle, unmistakable hint of disdain, as if describing a sterile, foreign land. Federal prosecutors get completely wrapped up in their rigid procedural manuals. Federal defense attorneys get so lost in abstract constitutional mechanics that they forget the actual damage done to the community. "And federal judges?" Boyd shook his head slowly, his expression shifting into a mask of mock sorrow. "Don't even get me started on the federal bench. That is a whole other situation entirely." "Boyd, please," Ruth said quietly, setting her napkin down with a soft, reprimanding sigh. "We have a guest at the table. You're editorializing again." "It's the same thing, Ruth," Boyd responded cheerfully, completely brushing her objection aside before turning his full, patronizing focus right back to me. "You work around the federal litigation system, Wren, so I'm sure you've witnessed it firsthand. You end up with these young, elite federal appointments who haven't stepped inside a chaotic, ground-level courtroom in 20 years. They sit comfortably behind a thick protective wall of brilliant young clerks and endless procedural delays, handing down sweeping decisions that alter or shatter human lives without ever having to feel the actual heavy weight of the courtroom. They are entirely insulated from reality. And let me tell you, insulation makes a judge soft." As Boyd continued to speak, his words triggered a sudden, vivid memory in my mind. I found myself thinking back to my early days as a public defender. Sitting in a cramped, windowless interview room, the heavy smell of cheap floor wax and old coffee hanging in the air, looking across a metal table at a terrified 19-year-old kid whose entire future depended on whether I could find a single fatal flaw in the state's rushed warrant. I remembered the exact suffocating weight of knowing that a human being's liberty rested entirely on my shoulders before I ever transitioned to appellate work. I knew exactly what the law felt like when it was heavy. Cal, who had been concentrating fiercely on his food to avoid exploding, suddenly let his fork clatter sharply against his porcelain plate. "Dad, stop. You don't know what you're talking about." "Cal, it's perfectly fine," I interrupted quickly, casting a reassuring, steady look at my boyfriend. I turned my head back to Boyd, offering him a calm, entirely serene smile. "I'm listening. Please, continue, Mr. Whitmore." Boyd grinned, absolutely delighted by my apparent docility. He truly believed he was performing an act of great professional generosity, imparting invaluable, old-school courtroom wisdom to a naive, young corporate associate who desperately needed his superior guidance. He had absolutely no idea that he was speaking to the highest legal authority in the district, or that his patronizing lecture was actively digging a massive psychological grave for his own pride. Before we move on to what happened next, I want to ask you a question. If you've ever had to handle a profoundly condescending person, by simply letting them talk until they completely run out of air, type the words, "Silence is power," in the comments right now. Because that is exactly what I did. I let him talk because I knew that the longer he spoke, the bigger the trap he was creating for his own massive ego. I waited until Ruth had quietly gathered the last of the dinner plates, the soft clatter of porcelain providing a stark, rhythmic backdrop to the thick, heavy stillness that had settled over the dining room. The space felt vacuum-sealed, holding the exact kind of high-tension quiet that precedes a violent drop in barometric pressure right before a major storm rolls across the valley. "You're right about one thing, Boyd," I said, setting my silver fork down with a tiny controlled click that echoed with surprising sharpness against the polished wood of the table. "The weight of the law is exactly what makes you careful. When you are the person who has to rule on a high-stakes motion, sign a wiretap order, or hand down a federal sentence, that weight is always present in the room with you. It sits squarely on your shoulders every single day, whether you want it to or not." Boyd's silver eyebrows knit together, his posture shifting slightly as his smile began to waver. The polite, passive listener he thought he had been effortlessly dominating for the last 45 minutes had vanished entirely. In her place sat someone with an undeniable, absolute authority that could not be faked. "I don't look at briefs through the eyes of my clerks," I continued evenly, holding his gray gaze across the linen tablecloth. "I read every single page myself. Twice, sometimes 3 times if the constitutional or procedural questions are complex. Because you are entirely right. The real families sitting in that courtroom deserve a judge who is fully awake to the reality of the law." Boyd's wineglass stopped halfway to his mouth, frozen solid in mid-air. "What exactly do you mean by that, Wren?" "I was confirmed to the federal district court 3 weeks ago," I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the precise, unyielding resonance of a formal courtroom decree. "I am the sitting federal judge for this district, Boyd." The silence that followed was completely, utterly deafening. Ruth froze entirely at the kitchen doorway, a stack of dirty dishes clutched tightly in her hands. Cal quietly rested his hands on his lap, letting out a massive, slow breath he had been holding in his chest for over an hour. Boyd's face went through a rapid, almost violent sequence of raw emotions, confusion, intense mental recalculation, deep-seated embarrassment, and then a sudden, sickening paleness. He was replaying every single condescending, sweeping claim about the federal bench he had just spent an hour throwing at the exact person who currently held the highest legal authority in the entire region. You're Judge Calloway, he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. The youngest federal appointment in this district in 60 years. I read about the Senate confirmation in the regional legal papers. I just didn't connect the last name. I know, I replied calmly. But I hadn't come to his house to humiliate a retired prosecutor over a plate of pot roast. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands flat on the table, keeping my tone entirely professional as I delivered the real devastating shift of the evening. And because I respect your 30 years of public service, Boyd, I am going to tell you something that must remain strictly within this room until tomorrow morning, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. On Friday afternoon, a sealed public corruption file was placed directly on my desk in chambers. It involves the current district attorney's office, specifically a federal investigation into a series of severely withheld Brady evidence from high-profile felony cases handled during your final 5 years in office. Boyd looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His heavy hands began to tremble slightly against the edge of the white tablecloth. The very ground-level reality and legal legacy he had spent the evening bragging about was now knocking directly on his own front door. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I am signing the formal federal warrants for those archives, I said softly. I believe you were a man of integrity, Boyd. But the people who succeeded you in that office were not. I suggest you call your old colleagues. Not to fix it, because you can't, but to prepare yourself and your family for the truth. The large, imposing man who had dominated the dining room for the last hour suddenly looked incredibly small in his heavy wooden chair. He didn't argue, he didn't defend his past convictions, and he didn't utter another word. He just stared down at the tablecloth, processing the dual shock of his own blinding arrogance and the looming legal storm that was about to break over his entire life's work. The following 14 days were a masterclass in psychological gravity. In the legal world, we often talk about the concept of tolling, the temporary freezing of a statutory clock. But for Boyd Whitmore, time hadn't frozen. It had slowed down to an agonizing crawl. Every tick of the clock in his quiet suburban home must have felt like a deliberate footstep approaching his door. On Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, as I had stated at his dinner table, I sat behind the mahogany bench in my chambers and signed the federal subpoenas for the county archives. I watched the ink dry on the official documents, fully aware of the chain reaction I was setting off. Within 48 hours, the local news was filled with headlines about a federal probe into the district attorney's office. The papers spoke of systemic failures and withheld exculpatory evidence from a decade prior. For a man like Boyd, whose entire identity, ego, and local standing were built upon the pristine nature of his old convictions, this wasn't just a legal crisis. It was a public dismantling of his life's work. I didn't hear a word from him for 2 full weeks. Cal told me that his father had gone into a state of total reclusion. He wasn't raging, he wasn't trying to pull strings, and he wasn't calling old political allies to ask for favors. Instead, Boyd was spending his days in his basement office, surrounded by his old trial logs, manually pulling his own duplicate files to see where the rot had started. He was finally doing what I had suggested. He was preparing himself for the truth. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in my chambers, deep into reviewing a series of complex motions regarding a civil rights violation, when my clerk knocked gently on the heavy wooden door. She had a look of mild confusion on her face. "Your Honor," she said, holding a yellow legal pad. "There is a Mr. Boyd Whitmore on the line. He says it's a deeply personal matter. Do you want me to route him to your voicemail?" I took off my reading glasses and rested them on the case file. "No, Sarah. Put him through to my desk phone, please. I picked up the receiver and waited for the click. Ren Calloway, I said, intentionally using my personal name rather than my official title to give him a shred of psychological breathing room. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the window of his house. When Boyd finally spoke, his voice was completely different from the booming, theatrical instrument that had dominated his dining room 2 weeks prior. It was stripped entirely of its old swagger, carrying a raspy, humbled quietness that sounded genuinely exhausted. I spent 30 years commanding a courtroom, Ren, he said, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat. And yet, I've been sitting here for 10 minutes completely forgetting how to start a conversation I never expected to have. You just did, Boyd, I said gently, leaning back in my leather chair and looking out at the gray city skyline. I'm listening. He let out a long, slow breath. I talked to Ruth at length about that Sunday dinner. She told me I should have called you days ago. And as usual, she was entirely right. He paused, the silence stretching between us for a beat. I wanted to call and apologize to you properly. Not just for the utter arrogance of lecturing you on your own profession, but for the blindness of my assumptions. I walked into my own dining room having already decided exactly what you were, and I spent an hour being incredibly unhelpful about it. I didn't deny your characterization at the time, Boyd, I replied smoothly, because some of your criticisms of the federal bench are entirely valid. Distance from the ground-level reality of prosecution and defense is a real risk. I'm aware of it every day. You could have completely humiliated me in front of my son and my wife, Ren, Boyd said, his voice dropping into a register of genuine vulnerability. You held all the cards. You had every legal and moral right to cut me down to size the very second I opened my mouth, but you chose to sit there and let me talk. You gave me enough dignity to examine myself honestly. And let me tell you, looking in the mirror these past 2 weeks hasn't been easy. It takes immense discipline to look into that mirror, Boyd, I said softly. Most people choose to smash it instead. Well, the mirror isn't smashed, but my pride certainly is, he chuckled darkly, though there was no bitterness left in him. I've spent the last 10 days cooperating fully with the federal investigators who came to my house. I handed over all my personal trial logs from those final 5 years. It turns out my chief deputy was the one burying the Brady material to keep his conviction rates inflated. I didn't know about it then, but I should have known. It happened on my watch. It's a painful realization, but the investigation is completely fair. Fairness is a practice, Boyd, not a permanent condition, I reminded him gently. It requires us to show up, pay attention, and correct the error even when the correction costs us our legacy. I'm learning that the hard way, he said, a faint trace of warmth returning to his tone. Ruth and I would like to invite you back to the house for dinner next Sunday if you're willing to give us a second chance. I can promise you one thing. There will be absolutely no lectures on the judiciary. I'd just like to know more about how you see the law. I smiled, a genuine feeling of relief washing over me. I'd like that very much, Boyd. I'll see you on Sunday. Thank you, Ren, he said softly, and for the first time, my name sounded entirely natural in his mouth. I'll let you get back to the work of the country. We did return to that split-level house the following Sunday afternoon. The drive out to the suburbs felt entirely different this time. The autumn air was crisper, the crimson leaves had mostly fallen, but inside the car, the suffocating cloak of anxiety was completely gone. Cal drove with one hand resting casually on the wheel. His shoulders relaxed, a quiet smile playing on his lips. When the front door opened, Boyd didn't stand on the porch like a gatekeeper trying to command the space. He stepped out onto the concrete steps, his hands shoved casually into his cardigan pockets, his gray eyes softened by an expression that looked remarkably like genuine humility. His handshake was still firm. Men like Boyd don't entirely lose their grip. But it was no longer a tactical cross-examination. It was a greeting of mutual respect. "Ren," he said simply, stepping aside to let us into the warmth of the entryway. "It's good to see you, Boyd," I replied, offering a warm, unforced smile. The house smelled exactly the same as it had 14 days prior. Rosemary, baked apples, and slow-cooked beef. As we walked into the dining room, I noticed that Ruth had set the table with the exact same linen cloth, the same formal napkins, and the same crystal glasses. I later learned from Cal that this was completely intentional on her part. Ruth believed that if you are going to successfully rewrite the painful memory of a disastrous meal, you should always use the exact same ingredients to do it. It was her quiet, brilliant way of letting us all start over from scratch. This time, the dynamic at the table had completely flipped. Boyd didn't treat the space like a personal stage for his sweeping monologues. He asked real, deeply curious questions, the kind that come from an authentic desire to understand another person's reality rather than the defensive need to fill a room with what you already think you know. He asked me about the cases I found the most legally and emotionally challenging on the federal bench. In turn, I asked him about the complex prosecutions he had been the most genuinely proud of during his 30 years in office. We didn't agree on everything, of course. We actively disagreed twice over dinner regarding the long-term societal impact of mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. But we disagreed the way two mature, highly experienced people disagree when they both actually know exactly what they are talking about. We followed the logical progression of the argument, wherever it led. Completely comfortable in the debate, without either of us needing to desperately win it. Cal sat comfortably between us, eating his pot roast, occasionally interjecting with a witty remark that made both of us break into genuine laughter. After dinner, while Cal stayed in the kitchen to help his mother navigate the easy choreography of washing the dishes, Boyd and I ended up walking out onto the front porch together. October had sharpened into something significantly colder, the night air biting at my cheeks. Boyd stood with his hands tucked deep into his pockets, staring out into the dark, quiet suburban yard. "Cal told me something earlier today," Boyd said softly, his eyes fixed on a porch light that had just flickered on down the street. "What's that?" I asked, leaning my back against the wooden porch railing. "He told me that you almost didn't come back a second time," Boyd said, turning his silver head to glance at me. "He said you thought one dinner with me was probably more than enough." I hadn't realized Cal had shared that with him, and I took a brief moment to reconsider my words. "What do you think changed my mind, Boyd?" He looked back out at the dark yard, watching a stray autumn leaf tumble across the grass. A neighbor nearby was burning leaves, and the rich, nostalgic smell of it drifted past us in the cool breeze. "You changed your mind because I called you," Boyd said slowly. "And because when I called, I actually meant what I said." I nodded once, appreciating his blunt honesty. I've spent my entire career sitting behind a bench, and I've come to realize that most people will do almost anything to avoid accountability. They will lie, they will blame others, and they will hide behind their titles just to keep from admitting they were wrong. Boyd shook his head firmly. "Not in my house, Ren, and absolutely not at my table." I understood completely then what Cal had been trying to tell me from the very beginning. His father wasn't an easy man to deal with, and his ego could easily consume a room, but at his absolute core, he was fundamentally honest. And an honest person, in my personal and professional experience, is almost always worth the heavy work it takes to get to know them. Through the brightly lit kitchen window behind us, I could see Cal and Ruth moving around each other, laughing at some private joke as they dried the crystal glassware. Boyd watched them too, a soft, contented look settling over his rough features. "He's happy, you know," Boyd murmured softly. "I know," I smiled, watching Cal laugh. "I am too." "He's happy with you, Ren," Boyd said, nodding once to himself with the definitive finality of a man who had finished evaluating a case and had finally reached his verdict. He turned toward the front door and gestured for me to follow. "Come back inside. It's getting entirely too cold out here." As I followed him back into the warmth of the house, I realized that some people think about fairness as if it were the weather. Something abstract that simply happens to you, something you have absolutely no control over. But after sitting behind a federal bench long enough, I know for a fact that fairness is a daily practice, not a permanent condition. It requires you to show up, to pay full attention, and to be entirely willing to correct your own errors, even when doing so costs you your pride. Boyd Whitmore had spent 30 years demanding that other people do exactly that in his courtroom. On a quiet Sunday in October, he finally had the absolute discipline to do it himself. And that, in my experience, is exactly what the law looks like when it actually works. Thank you so much for sitting with me through this story today. If this narrative reminded you of the quiet power of staying steady in your own truth, leave a comment down below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep, calm drama stories. Stay steady, stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.